The sky is unforgiving, and often, the margin between a safe landing and a total loss is just a few critical seconds. From engine fires on takeoff to landing gear failures and low-altitude stalls, survival depends on one thing: immediate, decisive action. Today we analyze 10 cases where pilots faced the ultimate test, showing us that even in a crisis, control is everything. These are the lessons of the cockpit. Stay focused. This is Military Expert. Let's dive in. He survives, but the setup to this crash is what matters. The flight begins on a flat, dry field, and at first, nothing looks unusual. It gets airborne and begins a normal-looking climb. What makes this clip deceptive is that the emergency does not seem to begin right after liftoff. For a short time, the aircraft remains airborne and under control. Then the margin begins to disappear. The aircraft is now low, slow, and over rough terrain. And once the bank increases this close to the ground, recovery space is gone. The pilot appears conscious after impact. The exact trigger cannot be confirmed from the video alone, but the lesson is clear. Once a powered paraglider gets low with little energy and little room, every second matters. He ends up high in the trees, and he can't get down on his own. He survives, but watch how quickly this flight goes wrong. This happened on the eastern side of Ålleberg in Sweden on April 11th, 2026. The launch looks routine, and the glider climbs away cleanly. At first, nothing seems out of the ordinary. But as the flight continues, the pilot gets lower and closer to the wooded slope. There's now very little clearance, and options are running out. Once you're this low near trees, even a small misjudgment can become a trap. And that's exactly what happens. The paraglider strikes the trees, and the pilot ends up suspended high above the ground. He cannot climb down by himself. Rescuers and bystanders gather below as the pilot remains stuck high in the branches. Before he can be brought down, the branch gives way and he falls to the ground. The lesson is clear. Once a paraglider gets too close to trees, the situation can escalate fast, and even a survivable snag in the canopy can turn into a second impact. On October 2nd, 2021, Spirit Flight was still on its takeoff roll in Atlantic City when the right engine suddenly burst into flames.
Remain seated. People get you. Remain seated. Fight it!
This was not an in-flight fire. The aircraft had not even become airborne. Just seconds earlier, everything looked normal from the cabin. Then a large bird struck the right engine during the takeoff roll, and the situation changed almost instantly. A few moments later, the fire became clearly visible from inside the plane.
Seated. People get you. Remain seated. Fight it!
Investigators later found that the bird strike fractured a fan blade, triggered severe vibration, damaged a fuel tube, and fed the fire inside the engine area.
Ladies and gentlemen, the fire trucks are on their way. Please remember, you do not have to get up.
At that point, the crew rejected the takeoff instead of trying to continue. The crew stopped the aircraft on the runway after receiving an engine fire warning. After the plane stopped, the emergency situation changed. The fire gradually began to die down. And that is the critical phase, because the aircraft is no longer moving fast, but the fire is still active outside the cabin.
I don't know.
What makes this case so important is that the airplane never became airborne. The crew kept the emergency on the runway.
It's not,
Passengers evacuated onto the runway, and 4 people suffered minor injuries during that evacuation. A bird strike during takeoff can look sudden, but the real danger is what it does next to the engine and how quickly the crew has to respond. The lesson here is clear. When a bird strike leads to engine damage and fire during takeoff, recognition has to be immediate. The rejected takeoff has to be decisive, and the evacuation has to stay disciplined. That is what kept this runway fire from becoming far worse. On July 20th, 2017, Major Brett DeVries walked away from one of the most unusual A-10 emergency landings on record. But the clip only shows the final seconds, not the malfunction that caused it. This was the end of a training mission that had gone badly wrong over Michigan's Grayling Air Gunnery Range. By the time of this approach, the aircraft had already lost its canopy and could not make a normal landing on fully functional gear. The damage had begun during weapons training, when the A-10's gun malfunctioned, and the emergency escalated almost instantly. Now, the whole challenge is to keep a badly damaged jet under control all the way to the runway. A second A-10 flashes over the camera as the emergency landing unfolds below. Even after touchdown, the emergency is not over. The damaged aircraft still has to stay under control as it slides to a stop. This is the part most viewers miss. The job is not over at touchdown. The aircraft still has to stay controllable all the way to a stop. DeVries kept it together, brought the A-10 to a stop, and got out alive. What makes this case remarkable is not just the damage, but the discipline it took to bring the aircraft back and finish the landing. The lesson here is simple. Catastrophic failures do not always end in the first seconds. Sometimes, survival depends on everything that comes after. Control, judgment, and the ability to fly a damaged aircraft all the way to the ground. On August 1st, 2017, this training flight ended just off U.S. Highway 69 near Mount Selman, Texas, and a constable's dash cam caught the final seconds. The problem had started before the camera ever saw it. This is not a normal low pass. By the time it enters the frame, the airplane is already just above treetop height. Now the margin disappears. The airplane is low, slow, and entering a turn with almost no room left to recover. Then the nose drops, the wing falls off, and the airplane hits the ground just east of the highway. This is the critical teaching point. Once airspeed decays this low after takeoff, there is almost nothing left to trade for recovery. There were 2 men on board. The instructor suffered minor injuries, and the student pilot was seriously injured, but both survived. Drivers stopped almost immediately as the wreck came to rest beside the road. The available accident summaries say the engine suffered a partial power loss from carburetor icing. During the soft-field takeoff, adequate airspeed was not maintained. The wing exceeded its critical angle of attack, and the airplane stalled. What makes this case so important is that it happened during initial climb, where any loss of power and any loss of airspeed become dangerous almost immediately. The lesson is clear. After takeoff, especially during training, airspeed has to come first. A partial power loss can still be survivable, but once speed decays and a turn begins at low altitude, the margin is almost gone. The gear warning horn is already sounding, and seconds later, this Cessna touches down on its belly. This is not a collapse after touchdown. The landing is continuing, with the gears still up. This video was uploaded on March 2nd, 2008, but the exact date and location of the incident itself could not be independently confirmed. Nothing in the approach looks dramatic at first, which is exactly why this kind of mistake is so dangerous. The warning is there, the runway is coming up fast, and the aircraft keeps descending. Then the airplane settles onto the runway, with the landing gear still retracted. This is the point where the error becomes damage, and there is no longer any clean way out of it. After touchdown, the emergency is no longer about the checklist. It is about keeping the aircraft under control as it slides to a stop. And only after the contact does the full reality of the mistake hit the cockpit. The available descriptions say the propeller was bent and the belly of the aircraft was damaged in the slide. The lesson here is simple. Gear-up landings are rarely caused by a lack of warning. They happen when routine, distraction, and habit drown out the warning that is already there. On August 29, 2009, this Socata TB-20 touched down at Megève, Altiport, with the landing gear still up. The warning horn can still be heard in the cockpit as the aircraft slides along the runway. The approach itself looks calm and controlled, which is exactly why this kind of error can sneak all the way to touchdown. Nothing about the flight path screams panic. The airplane is lined up, descending normally, and still nobody catches the real problem. The cockpit warning is already there, but the landing continues anyway. Now the runway is filling the windshield, the margin is disappearing, and the decision window is almost gone. Then the airplane settles onto its belly instead of its landing gear. This is not a landing gear collapse after touchdown. The gear was simply never selected down. From this point on, the only job left is to keep the aircraft straight and let it slide to a stop.
And only after the touchdown does the full reality of the mistake seem to hit the cockpit. Open source reports identify 3 people on board, no fatalities, and only minor aircraft damage. What makes this case so striking is that the airplane was controllable almost all the way through. The real failure was not aerodynamic, it was procedural. The lesson here is simple. Gear-up landings are often not caused by a total lack of warning. They happen when routine, distraction, or expectation override the warning that is already there. On May 3, 2003, this Cessna Skymaster touched down gear up at Coventry after the right main landing gear failed to lock. This was not a sudden collapse. It was an intentional emergency landing. The aircraft had been on a post-maintenance test flight when the crew found that the right main gear would not lock down. After repeated unsuccessful attempts to extend the gear, the pilot shut both engines down and committed to a grass landing beside runway 23. The touchdown is firm but controlled, and the airplane stays upright. This is the critical moment. The landing gear problem is now fully committed to the surface, and there is no go-around left. From here, the entire job is to keep the aircraft straight, bleed off speed, and let the slide work in your favor. What makes this landing impressive is not just the touchdown, but the discipline after touchdown. The airplane remains controllable all the way through the slide. By the time the aircraft comes to rest, emergency vehicles are already moving toward the scene. All 3 people on board survived without injury, and the aircraft suffered only minor damage. The lesson here is simple. When a landing gear problem cannot be fixed in the air, the safest outcome often comes from a clear decision, a stable touchdown, and keeping the aircraft under control all the way to a stop. This older VH-FTM clip does not begin with the problem. It begins with the moment the margin finally runs out. And even here, the airplane is still being kept under control. The video was uploaded in November 2008, but the exact date and location of this landing have not been independently confirmed. On approach, the aircraft looks stable, but one crucial part of the landing gear setup is not right. The pilot keeps the nose high and uses the main gear first, trying to delay the nose contact for as long as possible. This is the key to the whole landing. Every extra second with the nose off the surface reduces the violence of the final contact. The airplane bleeds off speed on the mains first, exactly where the pilot still has some control left. Then, the nose drops, the propeller strikes, and the aircraft disappears into a cloud of dust. The touchdown is no longer clean. But by this point, the hardest part has already been done. The airplane comes to rest upright, and the people on board appear to get out safely. This appears to be an earlier separate VH-FTM occurrence, not the later documented events involving the same airframe. The lesson here is simple. In a nose gear emergency, the best possible outcome often depends on one thing: touching down on the mains, keeping the nose up, and giving away as much speed as possible before the final contact. In March 2006, this OV-10D Plus made a gear-up landing at Alpena Air Force Base in Colombia. This was not a sudden collapse after touchdown. The aircraft was deliberately being brought home on its belly. The opening titles identify the aircraft as 155436 and frame this as a landing gear emergency. The original upload claims one release cable had been shot out, preventing full extension of all 3 landing gears, but an official public report confirming every detail of that damage mechanism could not be found. By the time the aircraft comes into view, the emergency has already been managed to the point of a committed landing. At this stage, the problem is no longer diagnosis, it is execution. The pilot no longer has the option of a routine landing. The only task left is to touch down as cleanly as possible and keep the aircraft straight. Now the runway is filling the frame. The margin is almost gone, and every control input matters. Then the OV-10 settles onto the runway without usable landing gear. This is the point of no return. After this, the only way out is to manage the slide. What makes this landing impressive is not just the touchdown, but how well the aircraft stays aligned as it slides. This is the part many viewers underestimate. The emergency is not over at contact. It is over only when the aircraft stops. Even heavily compromised, the aircraft remains controllable enough to turn a potentially destructive landing into a survivable one. The aircraft stays upright, and the landing sequence ends without the kind of breakup that might have followed a less controlled touchdown. Open source context strongly suggests this was a U.S. contractor-operated OV-10D, working in Colombia's counter-narcotics program, rather than a standard Colombian Air Force OV-10. The lesson here is simple. Once a gear emergency can no longer be solved in the air, survival depends on discipline, alignment, and carrying a damaged aircraft all the way through the landing without losing control.